they come in from the keynote. So this is going to be kind of an informal session, question and answer session with CISOs from prominent companies. I am Jeff Moss, your moderator, and today on the Magical Mystery Tour, we'll discuss 4 or 5 questions that I have prepared for the panelists. And then from there, we'll move to audience questions and answers. After we get through the initial kind of set of questions, I want to elicit questions from the audience. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. All these people know each other pretty well, and they really like to talk. So we were thinking of getting an egg timer and a bell to cut them off, but we couldn't find one in time in Las Vegas. I guess you leave your egg outside and it just cooks itself. So I'll try to be fairly strict, make sure that we stay on point and stay focused. So that said, we'll kick it off. Our panelists include Scott Blake from Liberty Mutual, Pamela Fusco from Merrick & Co. That'd be, yeah, that's you.
That would be me.
Yeah. Andre Gold from Continental Airlines. Ken File, okay, from Capital IQ. And Justin Sumani.
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 Yeah, it just rolls off the tongue.
It does. From VeriSign. Okay, so a little background on each of the panelists. So first up is Scott Blake. We're gonna air all of your dirty laundry right here. You're in the top 5 of the property and casualty insurer in the U.S., Liberty Mutual. $16,618 million in sales. So what would that be? $16.6 billion in sales. You've got 38,000 employees from 2003. It's the last we could find stats on your company. And your competitors include Allstate, Prudential, and State Farm. So if you could grab the microphone, just tell us, just in a short sentence, what is your #1 business issue you're dealing with? And then also, what is your #1 security issue?
Okay, I would actually say that from my point of view anyway, the #1 business and security issues are probably the same. One of the things that I'm trying to do is to create a cultural change within the organization to change the idea that risk is owned by IT. Right? When I came into the organization about a year ago, security was viewed as a technical problem, something that we as the IT folks should try to hide from the business as much as possible, that we should just make it go away to the greatest extent that we could. And I came in and said, that's all wrong. What we need to do is make sure that the business understands the risks that they have and that they are signing off on and accepting and understanding their risks. So my job becomes then to make sure that they understand and are making intelligent decisions about how to correctly manage the risk across all of our IT infrastructure, all of our information shipments and what have you.
So it's mostly in communication now. You're trying to educate management.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it. Yeah, communication is certainly a major part of that. One of the things that I've been doing is putting in place a formal risk management, a risk assessment methodology that includes participation from the business people. So they're participating with us in understanding what the risks are and making decisions about what we should be doing with them.
Okay. Our next panelist is Pamela from Merrick & Co. The large pharmaceutical, you're best known for Propecia and Vioxx. They did $22.9 billion in sales in 2004 and have roughly 63,000 employees. And then their well-known competitors would be Bristol Myers, Squibb, and Pfizer. So we're going to ask you the same question. Are they 2 separate issues or the same, sort of like Ken?
It's a little bit of both. One is there's never enough drugs. So that's one of our biggest issues there. No, I think from a security business perspective, in a corporation like Merck, being pharmaceutical, that security is driving the business. One of our largest initiatives at this point in time is digital signatures from a compliance perspective. Last look, we had 273 different compliances that we had to adhere to. So trying to pull all of that together and understand what's applicable and what's not, and then how are we maintaining that, and are we maintaining compliance? We wouldn't know because there's 273, so figuring that out. But I think the biggest part is security is driving our business because we are focused from a security perspective internal to Merck, the corporate side, so all the IT, as well as the business side. So enabling digital signatures and identity and access management is another major player that we're undertaking right now. We'll enable the business because time to market will be faster.
And how much of that pressure would you say is coming from business leaders inside versus government regulation outside?
The digital signatures, from a monetary perspective, is definitely coming internal to the corporation. Justification would be along the lines is a competitor went to market 30 days before we did with a similar drug. This was several years ago. We never made it up to the peak that they made it to with the revenue generation just because they made it out there 30 days before us.
Okay.
Time to market, and we're talking billions of dollars, if you will. So externally, of course, from an FDA perspective, Part 11, we certainly do want to have digital signatures that are legally binding. Big misconception in the world there. What's legal, what's not, what holds up in court.
Okay. Our next panelist is Andre Gold from Continental Airlines. Last we checked, for the slide, you're the number 5 U.S. carrier, trailing United, American, Delta, and Northwest, grossing about $9.7 billion and over 38,000 employees in 2004. So I'm going to ask you the same question as well. Is the business issue and your number 1 security issue separate? Are they same?
So I've been out at Continental since '96, and I put that in perspective in the sense that back in '96, IT was very, very small, and at that time I was running our e-commerce environment. And with that said and everything else, technology was actually trying to add value to the business. And with that said and everything else, in the role of information security now, I look back and I say, okay, you can build applications and environments predicated on 3 things, cheap, fast, and secure. And at the time when you're trying to add value to the business, you're building applications based upon how quickly you can deliver them and how cost effectively you can deliver them.
Right.
And so going back and integrating security now into the fabric is somewhat of a challenge. So with that said and everything else, the second thing from a security perspective, it's the cultural, manifestation, within our respective environment and everything else.
Right.
Is that, when you have a group of, guys and girls who've been, part of the environment, for, 6, 7, 8, 9 years now, right? Now you're telling them to go back and actually starting to integrate, security into the fabric, that becomes, a huge challenge.
Right. So you're facing a lot of the same issues Scott is on educating business leaders inside.
Absolutely.
And then it sounds like, you had to build your systems because that's what the market pressures were to do. I mean, you had to build something, so you built something, and now the pressures are security.
Right. That's what the market pressures were to do. That's what the business was coming back, and articulating to us.
Right.
So
and then you'd say over the time since you've started, the business pressures have changed.
Well, not only has the business pressure changed, there's regulatory issues that we have to face now.
Okay.
And so, those are drivers that actually aid, me and my respective role in actually instituting, security within the fabric of the organization.
Okay. So would you say then, just like with Andre, I'm sorry.
I'm the only one that begins with A.
I know,
over there.
you are. I'm sorry, I think it was for Justin, or, no.
Scott.
That would be Scott.
I'm totally, Ken. It was for,
So Jeff was out late last night?
there's this great party.
Yeah, the speakers party that we had last night.
What I was trying to tie into was how much of that pressure you're getting, you mentioned government regulation, like with Pamela's problems, how much of that do you see over the last 5, 6 years, the government portion of regulation increasing faster than the internal pressures, and now it's really, you're reactionary to this legislation?
Well, the government pressures as it relates to the impact of our business has absolutely increased. I mean, when you start talking about an airline, you start talking about 9/11 and everything else. I mean, one can easily put 2 and 2 together and say, okay, wow, things have obviously changed.
Right. Okay, now we're going to get to Ken.
Do you want me to be Ken, or do you want Ken to be Ken?
No, you can, would you like to be Ken?
No.
Anybody out there want to beat me?
Ken's at Capital IQ, the media company. It's a division of McGraw-Hill. Roughly $94.5 million in sales and over 700 employees. You can see by the competitors, Dun & Bradstreet, LexisNexis, and Thomson, that it's, I'm guessing it's a lot of information aggregation and sorting. So your market pressures are probably slightly different than a commercial carrier.
It's kind of we're in kind of a strange place since being acquired late last year. I mean, previously we were a privately owned company, so and not subject to all of the regulations and everything that comes along with being part of a large public company. So now we're having to deal with those growing pains, as well as all of the things that we've typically done in the past. I think our primary business issues regarding security has been the governance aspects and who owns it and how much they own it, and just like any other corporation. And I think that you're going to find those battles pretty much going on just about everywhere. Because face it, if you look at it from the end user on up, security is pretty much a part of everyone's job, whether they know it or not. Which brings us into the whole educational aspect of things, and kind of letting people know what role they play and how it's going to play out in the big picture. I'd have to say, from the technical perspective, the number one security issue obviously is application security. It's it's core to our business, and what we're doing. I mean, we aggregate both publicly available data, as well as we allow for project creation and financial consultants and analysts to actually manage projects on our system. So we've got the whole collaborative effect going. Plus we have a great deal of their proprietary information that we've got to worry about as well.
So if you could wave your magic security wand and make one security pain go away, what is your number one security pain right now?
Oh, magic wand. That's like going into a
Microsoft's got one, I hear, in their latest Office suite.
If I could just pick one thing for Christmas, I would have to say getting more executive buy-in and getting security placed within a higher priority at the upper echelon of the organization.
So that seems like a constant theme. I mean, I'm not hearing a whole lot about vendors aren't selling us appropriate technology or the technology doesn't exist. I'm hearing mostly that it's institutional issues with communication internally. It's no longer really a technology problem, it sounds like.
We've had, since the acquisition, obviously, we've had a complete, organizational shift, if you will. Previously, as CSO there, I reported directly into executive management. I reported to the board of directors and the CEO directly. So, you kind of had that here to go with. Now as you kind of the little fish being swallowed by the big fish, we're a division of Standard and Poor's, which is a McGraw-Hill company. So try and figure that one out, and then figure out how convoluted that's going to get as far as the organizational perspective.
Right. Magic wand doesn't cover that.
No.
No.
Not even the big stick.
And our last panelist is Justin
Semani.
Sumani.
We'll get it by the end of the month.
I am embarrassed I can't pronounce your name. So.
Well, even my own family had issues.
From VeriSign, I think we've nicknamed you a security behemoth with $1.1 billion in sales and over 3,200 employees in 2004. Most visible competitors would be considered, I'm guessing, RSA and Symantec. Symantec's been on quite a buying spree recently, growing. And so I'll pose you the same two questions. Number one business issue, number one security issue.
So historically, from a business perspective, we haven't had some of the executive buy-in problems that a lot of other companies have, specifically probably the core business of what we do. Some of the main business problems are really cultural shifts on companies that we acquire. A lot of these are smaller companies, either startups, and it's a huge dramatic change coming into a lot more rigorous, a lot more detailed security-wise and process-wise companies. So that's really the biggest one. And then from a technical perspective, application security obviously is on everybody's minds right now, and we're no different. However, there are some things that we're looking to do for the next year in order to position ourselves for the next 5 years that the technology really isn't there. Where we look at 802.1x and supplemental authentications and rerouting and things, forward progressions on companies like Cisco that they're actually looking into. But unfortunately, the technology really hasn't even created in beta yet. So we're trying to resolve some of those issues.
So would you, in your industry then, how would you rate the government regulation versus the internal?
So I look at things like Sarbanes-Oxley specifically as something that was unfortunate that needed to happen. I think it did need to happen. The problem with things like SOX is that the interpretation in regards to how it really needs to be applied is probably a little misconstrued by a lot of companies. Fundamentally, when you look at
Well, and would you say that's consulting companies kind of trying to get the strictest reading to generate the most consulting dollars, or?
Right. I mean, there's two fundamental problems. You have the application of COBIT under ITGCC, which is general. However, it still leaves a lot to be desired when you actually hit the rubber meets the road from a testing measure kind of perspective. So a lot of companies really need to figure that out for themselves, not only process-wise, but also technical. Where historically they either never had a security organization or this is relatively new to them, which, you know, it's a lot of money that really needs to be invested in that, and rightfully so. The problem is that if you've never really done it before, or done it quasi, you go to the end of the extreme when you start talking about federal regulations and being impacted by, you know, PCAOB and oversight committees. So yeah, I think that the interpretation by consulting driving the companies and how they need to apply it definitely has left a lot to be desired for the realistic applications that need to be driven into it.
So then, if I handed you the security wand, the spirit stick of security.
Get rid of the people. That's what it actually is. Yeah.
You just you'd replace them all with a small Perl script?
That would be nice.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had a magic wand, I think processes are the biggest things, and having those be a little bit more adaptable to companies coming in, and not only our own companies. You know, once you acquire a company, you're looking at a good 3, 4, 7 years perhaps, and really finalizing that acquisition, be it culture, be it their applications, be it their processes. So if I had a magic wand, that would really be the one.
That'd be streamline that whole.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to some questions for everybody. I've got, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got maybe 5 suggested topic areas. The first one is in the area of certifications. And I've just got a couple of bullet points here. The value of certifications, what are the limitations of certifications? Wow. Do certifications make any kind of, do they even register in the hiring process? And if so, how much weight do you apply to certifications? And then there's so many certifications out there, do you guys try to even differentiate between the different types of certifications? So I'm going to start off with Justin. Just because he, from what we could tell, he holds no certifications. And you are currently the Director of Info Security at VeriSign.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently it hasn't slowed you down in your career.
No.
Hasn't stopped you from achieving, you know, a top-level position.
Right.
So I have a feeling that your, you know, your opinion on this is going to be separate from somebody trying to push a certification.
Sure. So I think certifications, be it CISP, SSP, et cetera, are not necessarily a bad thing. The problem that I have is if they're interpreted as that information is the way to go. There's a lot of things in order to accomplish task A which you cannot certify. How do you influence the business? How do you get them to do what you need them to do? That's
all the elements wrapped up in the communication.
communication and political. I think that is probably one of the main real issues that really need to be driven as far as skill sets within somebody manager and up kind of level. Technically wise, absolutely. You know, the fundamentals of security are definitely driven in within the certifications, and comprehension of those is pretty critical in order to drive where we need to go. I think the certifications, when we look at them from, I think their origination back in 1997, I think when they started to come out, have come a long way. And so we're applying a lot more weight to them, whereas historically we have not. Oddly enough, I think everybody in security, except for me, has gotten certifications. So,
Well, I did a quick Google or Monster search to see what were the top certifications, and by far, when you were looking for security jobs, the #1 certification mentioned was the MCSE from Microsoft. That was followed up. That's what they were requiring, or they would like to see on the resume. The #2 thing was CISSP. closely behind MCSE, and then half, half the number they were asking for other things such as the CISO or the CISO or the SCP or the GIAC, or and then they just dropped to 0. So it really seemed that there are two major players in this space. There's Microsoft and there's ISC squared, and then everything else just seems to be in the weeds.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised about the Microsoft one.
Yeah. Probably because they didn't know, it's the MCSE with the security sub
Right.
cert.
Yeah, and I think, specifically that one's probably driven.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Administrative or
Yeah.
management.
Right, no, when we search just computer security jobs.
Right.
So most of the jobs are going to be technical jobs.
MCSE.
So then, and that's perfect, because the next person that this question was going to is Pamela Fufu, who holds a CISSP, a CISM, and a CHS-III or -3. So you have plenty of.
I'm certifiable, that's
Yeah.
for sure. What do I think of certifications? A couple of things. Number one is I've been in the security industry quite a while, and I think that we've migrated. We've migrated from doing our own thing to a professional culture, and I think that makes a big difference. I certainly have folks on my team that are stellar performers that I would put up against anybody that don't have certifications. So when I'm looking for someone to work with on my team, or digging back to what I did years ago when I didn't have certifications, or there were no certifications, I kind of look at the skill set. And I'm not looking for an MCSE, because that's a point in time certification to me. I'm looking for someone who's broad, and I'm looking for skill sets that can be expandable. Do you understand, IDS? Do you understand IPS? Can you, routing tables, firewalls, IDS, SAV, NAT, you name it, whatever it is. So a broad knowledge, and I think that there are some certifications out there that capture that broad knowledge. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to have it, but if we're talking about the financial industry, I believe that there are probably some certifications that someone should have from an auditing perspective.
Broad perspective,
So
right.
from a certification perspective, I think it depends upon the role in which you're playing in security at that point in time. If you're junior, I wouldn't expect you to have some high-level certification. If you're senior, I probably would expect you to have some type of experience across the board with incident response and so on and so forth.
Okay. What I'm thinking I'm going to do is going to go through each one of these slides. I've got questions set outside for everybody here, so you all get a chance to answer a question, and then we'll move into a general discussion. So the next up is zero-day research. And I want to touch on, what is the role of the researcher, the responsibility of the researcher? What's the role of the company who's funding the research, the responsibility of the company that's basically either paying the researcher as an employee or subcontracting it out, much now like Tipping Point, I guess, is going to have a zero-day party and announce that they're now buying zero-day bugs. And then also the responsibility surrounding full disclosure. And what I bring up here is, I can't remember his first name, but Kornburst, speaking on Oracle security at Black Hat, and he finally got so frustrated with Oracle after over a year of them not responding or fixing the bug that he just went public with it, which is sort of an extreme case. But if there's no movement on the vendor, is that responsible full disclosure? So we're going to start with Scott Blake. He's spoken at Black Hat before on the politics of vulnerabilities, and has thought about these issues quite a bit and written about them. So
Yeah, Jeff is dragging me back to my previous life.
Yeah.
Before joining Liberty Mutual, I was with Bindview and was running the security research group there. So there were a number of questions in there.
Yeah, the researcher responsibility, company responsibility, and then just...
Yeah. I think from that researchers and companies that are sponsoring research have a professional responsibility to attempt to contact the maintainer of whatever it is that they've discovered the flaw in, and to attempt to get to a resolution of that before generally releasing the information.
But not at any cost. I mean,
But not at any cost, no. I mean, if you look at the history of disclosure of security issues, back in the beginning, right, folks would come up, and those who were contacting the vendors for fixes would find often a, shall we say, negative response to their report. Something perhaps less than useful in getting there. And so they were left with going public as the only real way to address the problem and to get a fix to happen. Right? That over time changed to a point where everybody's favorite punching bag, Microsoft, was one of the worst in the beginning and became one of the best. And today, Microsoft is reasonably responsible about handling these issues. I mean, we have to give them credit for having, they have come a long, long way in dealing with this stuff. They're not perfect, nobody is, but it's not bad now. Now, we have seen, I think, in the last year or so, that it may be that the pendulum is starting to swing back the other way, where a couple of vendors, not to name any names, but Oracle is certainly a possible example there, and Cisco is another one as well, where we're seeing more of these negative responses to disclosure, to the preliminary disclosure, the responsible disclosure, where the researcher has gone to the vendor and said, please fix this. Now, what you're left with, again, is to pull out the stick that the researcher has of going public with the issue in order to force a response. It's, to my mind, the response of last resort, but it is nevertheless legitimate when you do get to that point. There have certainly been cases where I've been coordinating response to the vendor or through my own research where we had to threaten to go public to get anybody's attention at the target company. Usually that was enough. We could say, well, okay, well, you guys aren't responding, we're going to publish it next week. They would say, oh, okay, we better do something about that. And that was good. Right? That gets you where you need to be.
So now at Liberty Mutual,
yeah. Now on the other side of the fence.
Right, now on the other side of the fence. Well, I'm wondering though, now that you know there are these zero-day threats, and are you counting on industry to notify you when there's a new zero-day vulnerability, or do you have a whole procedure in place for trying to mitigate the danger posed by undisclosed bugs?
Well, we definitely try to design in a robust and fail-safe way to the greatest extent possible. I'm sure everybody does. That only gets you so far, and there is always going to be some residual risk left over for things that you haven't anticipated that come along. Whether or not there is a public issue is, to my mind, immaterial. What is material is whether or not the bad guys know about it. And you have to have as a planning assumption that the bad guys know about things that you don't know about, regardless of whether it's something that's public or not public. And so you have to plan for that. You have to have systems in place to try to catch those things that you don't know about, which of course is extremely difficult, but you have to try. Whether or not I don't feel strongly, now being on the other side of the fence, about, or I don't feel differently about how researchers should handle information. If the bad guys have the information, if the bad guys have an exploit, they have an exploit, and we have to assume that they have it regardless of whether it's public or not.
Okay. Okay, we move on to the next question, which is government influence. And this question is going to go to Andre. And the issues surrounding government influence, we see as sort of the regulatory impact against a business. How responsive do you have to be? Do you generally try to meet just the minimum requirements, maximum requirements? There's a lot of voluntary programs that the government suggests you try to follow. Then you have influence from the military requirements, and maybe they're driving some of the purchasing decisions. They have different needs than the rest of us. I want to mention In-Q-Tel just because they're sort of the civilian side to the CIA on the procurement. They try to influence maybe public companies or try to respond to the needs of public companies and provide technology either from the military to civilian or civilian to military. And then finally, how do you respond to the open source initiatives that the government has funded? The NSA's SE Linux project, they funded Bastille for Linux. They initially funded some Tor anonymous routing technology. And the tenuous connection to Andre is that he received his commission from the Army in Wentworth Military Academy. Thank you. Thank you for serving the country, sir.
Thank you.
So, coming from a little bit of that background, how do you view this government influence now in the private sector?
Excuse me. So we'll talk about a couple different things. I mean, it's a very
The broad strokes.
loaded, question, Jeff. Thank you.
I gave you a lot of rope.
Yes, she did. Hopefully I won't hang myself too much. So let's just from a requirements perspective, right? And not necessarily, when we start talking about requirements, it's not only from the government, it's also from the industry, as well. And with that said and everything else, as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges that we have, at Continental is a cultural challenge and everything else. And so when we started looking at things like, SOX, various TSA mandates, things like PCI and, a variety of regulatory requirements and everything else, one of the things that we said that I said we need to do is like, let's take a step back, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to build process and procedures to meet, necessarily government requirements, industry requirements and everything else. What we actually want to do is we want to take a step back and actually introduce process and procedures within the cultural fabric, by which, we can meet what the TSA, is wanting to do with secure flight, as well as we know what Visa and the credit card companies want to do with, PCI and stuff like that.
So your adaptability, you can respond to any new regulation quickly.
Absolutely, because I think, if we, try to, meet, the minimum, the maximum requirements of any one given regulation, I think that we'll always fail as a company as it relates to our ability to, address, information security issues as they arise within our environment.
So you'd say, yeah, don't focus on the specific. If you create a broad base, that will support your ability to comply with any given regulation.
Yeah, that's my take on it and everything else, and so because what you'll see over time is that, a lot of these, regulations, whether they're SOX, whether they're government, from my perspective, what, my company is dealing with, are sort of new, so to speak. And there's a lot of interpretation, left, within that respect of regulation. I think you mentioned earlier, some of the advent of SOX, why is it costing so much? Is it because of, the consulting, companies, strict, interpretation of it? And so what we've done is said, hey, let's take a step back, because if we're successfully, dealing from a common sense computing perspective, dealing with the issues, at hand, I think, we could address, all the regulatory as well as industry, requirements that may come our way.
Right. And then you don't really see, any military impact or Pentagon-driven, join the, what am I thinking, the FBI for a while had an initiative to...
It's interesting because, there's challenges that we face just organizationally, I sit in meetings a lot of times and, I'm with like various, council members and stuff like that, one's focusing on safe harbor initiatives, and then I get another one that's focusing on HIPAA, and they're both saying that they're responsible for, PII data and everything else. I'm like, okay, so who really owns this, at least from a council perspective? They're like, we both do. I handle it internationally, I handle it domestically. And then, so when you start thinking, we start getting to other things, from a government perspective, there's yet another silo within the organization that says, hey, I have, some stake in that as well.
Right.
And so, what, I've attempted to do is provide that overlay across the various respective business units, because
The foundation building.
exactly. And so, we're getting better as it relates to, understanding and articulating and identifying those issues that they come up, and make sure that we assign them to the appropriate entity, whether or not they're InfoSec, whether or not they're council related initiatives and stuff like that. But that still is a continued challenge within our environment. But there's not necessarily something a lot of times people look at and say, okay, well, you're airline, so there's just a plethora of regulations that you have to deal with. Well, absolutely. You want to make sure that the plane is serviced, that maintenance is there and everything else. But that's kind of, there's a whole lot of FAA and, other type of things that have been part of the fabric, and that hasn't changed.
Right.
Then there's been...
So it's just incremental over the years.
Exactly.
Okay.
In this space, there's a major common umbrella called international common criteria and the National Information Assurance Partnership that prohibits you, the government, requiring your applications if they don't meet these criteria. Information assurance applications, information assurance enabled applications like browsers or other issues on that one, database.
Okay. So if you want to play with the government, you need to meet these certain requirements.
Right here. What's the bill you're on that?
Well, I think that's under...
I just attended the CCUF Common Criteria Users Forum in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and that was one of the questions that was brought to the table, that the common criteria is so intense and expensive, not only for the vendors, but also for the organization that's undergoing the common criteria. And one of the things that's on the table is that there are so many different regulations and mandates and compliances and blah, blah, blah out there that the common criteria needs to be reassessed and reevaluated so that we meet the lowest common denominator across the board for compliance methodologies and standards. So you said from a government perspective, if you don't meet the international common criteria baseline, then as a vendor, you can't play in the government industry, right? No one's trying to meet the baseline pharmaceutical standards either. So the bottom line is that someone started standards, whether they're right or wrong, or whether they're applicable for today, they need to be examined. So just because we have a standard today doesn't necessarily mean that it will be the same standard next year, but we still need to voice folks like you to attend CCUF or anything along that line that says, hey, look, I'm working in this industry, but it doesn't seem like it's meeting the need, and we need to make a change. And that's the biggest problem. Folks think that when a standard's put in place, it's written in stone, and that's not the case. We need to be flexible, and we need to voice the opinion of what it is that needs to be stated.
And that's because that's coming from a cost perspective, and the difficulty to meet, or just because they're aged, they're brittle, and requirements no longer are relevant.
I think it's not necessarily irrelevant. I think what you're saying is again, going back to security is now a profession, you know, and right, they're very relevant. What we're seeing is a change in times. So as you said earlier, Jeff, the technology exists today. It's there. We've had brilliant people design it. It's implemented. Everyone's got a firewall. I wouldn't even consider that a security product. That's part of the network in my eyes, right? You don't go online unless you have AV. You don't go out the door unless you're dressed, right? Same principle applies. So what we're talking, well, some of us have to be dressed. So what I'm saying here is the fact that we need to put structure around it. So it's not necessarily that it's a rickety old compliant standard. It just needs to be reevaluated, kind of like tweaking your firewall rule set, tweak the regulations.
The government mandates new law, but they never go back and reevaluate it. You can't have a force on.
No, they just make another law to go on top of that, right?
And was it worth the money to get that?
That's what I'm saying. Exactly.
Wow. Yeah, so it's irrelevant in your market. Okay, we only have two left. The second to last is emerging threats. And I'll ask it to Pamela first, but then I'll open up to the panel here.
Don't we get breaks? I mean,
No, you don't get breaks. The reason I'm asking is that my information here says that you're in charge of your security incident response team. It runs 24/7, 365. So you probably are concerned about some of these emerging threats. One is, how do your businesses react to the increased speed to export? Before, emerging threat might take weeks, months to develop into an attack. Now the speed from patch to attack can be measured in days. I think Halvar Flock on his website shows him in real time downloading a patch from Microsoft, finding the vulnerability and exploiting it in 15 minutes. So when the time to attack is 15 minutes, you've got to do something differently that you didn't do 5 years ago. And so other threats like more sophisticated rootkits, and then the influence maybe of mafia money-making schemes. When organized crime gets in the game, it's no longer script kiddies. Your business has to change. Your threat model is not the bored college student anymore. Your threat model now is people who want to make money. So, how does your business process adapt? Yeah, tough.
So-
do you just buy new technology and update your anybody?
No. They need to give the NT boxes, number one. Let go of that box. I think in the pharma industry, it's a great industry. They make a lot of money. They're not a technology company. No pharmaceutical is, no healthcare industry is. Therefore, you see that the healthcare industry is behind the times when it comes to security and technology in many instances. So from that perspective of the zero-day threat, we probably we get a little bit in, it gets a little tricky sometimes with million-dollar pieces of devices that run on a system that's outdated, that's no longer supported by a vendor, but yet we need to maintain that device for whatever known reason because it produces, Vioxx or it produces Propecia and it's producing, $1 billion worth of drugs within a day. But yet we can't let go of that device. So how do I protect that? And if there's a patch out there from an FDA perspective, if I put a patch on the box that's technically modifying the system, therefore it needs to be recertified by the FDA, so you can't do that either. So we've done a couple of different things. One, secure different areas, put them in seclusion. Are they live in the network? Are they back end, front end? What are we talking about? And then the other part of it is that you have to work on a migration plan because you can't turn a blind eye anymore. And I think the biggest problem with internal to Merck, I can say, from a zero-day perspective, is I can't force them. And I've had to learn to pull back. Coming from, Digix and MCI, it was like, let's get it out there, let's do it, and it's done. At Merck, you have to pull back and say, okay, we're going to take baby steps here, and we're going to do it this way, and you can't just say, no, I need a migration plan. And we institute waivers, and one of the biggest things from a cultural perspective is the business doesn't always understand when they say no, the risk that they're accepting. Therefore, by giving them what we consider to be a waiver, saying, okay, Executive Vice President, do you understand by saying, no, I refuse this patch forever and always, and I'm not giving up, my NT server box, that you're accepting this risk for this company? And then they go, whoa, wait a minute. So that's really helped us spearhead it. Have we gotten to deploy things within 15 minutes? No.
So,
Are we going to get there? Hopefully.
so what you're saying, you're still coming up against not necessarily technology issues, it's still back to government regulation, compliance, and education.
I think they use we use the government regulation sometimes to cloak it. Because technically speaking, if the system is outdated and it's no longer supported by the vendor, then I'm not understanding in my mind how it can be a validated system.
Right.
So there's a little bit of political play there internally to use the FDA as
Would
a
anybody
cloak.
else on the panel like to add something to it?
So, from an emerging threat perspective, there's really two that we've been focusing on intently. One has to do with the DDoS attacks, specifically with the pervasiveness of bot networks and their usage in extortion schemes in order to levy money out of companies for bringing them back up. And the payment services attacks that occurred, I think last year, was a great example of that. So we haven't had any. It's a little bit, one of the things that you actually brought up crosses both lines. Some of the things that we're perceiving in the community is actually organized crime is actually getting more and more involved. Specifically when we start seeing financial value coming out of those attacks, be it extortion, and one of the other ones is the introduction of very strategically focused malware infections targeting certain companies to bypass endpoint security. This endpoint security typically is almost non-existent, or it's a simple user ID and password. They're getting more sophisticated and targeting specific applications of wire transfers, etc. Common. Yeah, it's common. Most of the zero-day stuff is still within a super subset of the community, where even within that subset, a portion of them still adhere to some of the old guard rules in regards to it's a zero-day issue. Hacking is an experience more than a destructive kind of mechanism. Exactly. But what you have is, the organized crime rings that were identified by MI5 out of Israel, as well as the Russian organized crime are getting involved in it, and it's coming down the pike. And actually, when we reflect on that and look back to the difficulty of a lot of companies applying to some bottom level standards and requirements, it's a scary position for a lot of companies in the U.S. to meet, especially when still malware and a lot of issues are still a pervasive problem. I think the technology will resolve 80% is already there. Some of the endpoint security still is not there. Of course, from VeriSign, certificates, are a good way to go down. Well, yeah, I won't say that, but you know, I think that even with certificates, it's a piece on that desktop, and when that desktop is compromised, you know, what do you really have?
This is an open question for Ken. What would you say your number one concern was if you've been in this game in 95 versus 2005? What's changed in the last 10 years in the emerging threat area? And, you know, can you look into the future? Do you have a crystal ball, or are you so busy right now in the trenches day to day that there's no crystal ball exists?
I don't know. Back in '95, it was a much different world, and I think, you know, as things and systems get much more complex, and the speed at which they operate and the connectivity, and you know, I think that has, you know, primarily been, you know, the biggest focus and biggest shift as to, you know, how fast something can be done versus, you know, 10 years ago. Be it, you know, compromise the system, be it, you know, conduct a business transaction, whatever. But, you know, I mean, in speaking with the, you know, with the ODA stuff, how do you protect against something that you don't know? You know, I don't consider something that's got a patch released for it to be an ODA. You know, it becomes, you know, at that point, how quickly can you get the pea out of the pool is basically how it works. So.
Don't go in the pool.
So then, looking in your crystal ball, what do you see? Just more of the same, faster, faster, faster?
A lot more of the same, and a lot more complexity, and the more bells and whistles, I think, that get thrown into things. You know, the greater risk that you stand, and somebody, you know, finding, okay, well, this bell hooks into the OS at, you know, at a kernel level, and, you know, does some really bad things. So
The cost of, it sounds like the cost of doing business requires security. The cost of doing security seems to be an ever increasing part of the budget. At some point, you're going to hit a ceiling, right? You can't charge $10 billion for buyout. You can't.
Propecia.
Propecia.
Well, I think some of the issues with a lot of companies is really implementing a solid technical and process infrastructure in the company to resolve a lot of the problems. There's a lot of fighting fires instead of really implementing processes to resolve the root issue.
Band-aid strategy.
Exactly, and that's where you know, my perception is you get a lot of the lost funds and why the budgets increase. Obviously, you know, there's more technologies, more applications, and that's going to require more people, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a lot of the root money that's going into the security organizations and companies are really dealing with firefighting issues. Now, going back to your earlier question in regards to what do I see coming down in the next 5 years, I think technology is always changing, and hasn't been different before, and it's not going to be different in the future. I think the difference that we're going to see is the skill set and involvement of truly malicious and highly organized individuals, and that's going to change. It's already changing.
Right. They're going where the money is.
Exactly, and where they didn't have the skill set to really be able to jump into technology attacks, or to be able to leverage it for really substantial gains, multi-million dollar kind of issues. They're seeing those avenues open up, and they're jumping in.
Okay, we're going to go to our last question here. This is on the question of open source. It's, basically 3 points. Do you use open source? Perceived risks of open source versus perceived risks of commercial software? And then your contributions to open source, be it through procedures that you write that you give away to the community, or how do you see any value in participating in sort of an open source forum? And I think this one's going to start off with Ken. Just so that you've authored or participated on many folks dealing with open source technology issues. So
Correct.
you get to kick it off.
Great. Well, the first, the use of open source. There are certain applications, and you know, everything, it comes down to how applicable it is to your business model. I mean, you want to start looking at all these, you know, ROI studies and all this other, you know, stuff that they throw at you and say, you know, the cost of running this versus the cost of running that. That's all purely subjective. You know, take it down to your, you know, to your business level, and you know, look at it from that perspective and what makes the most sense. Where are your core competencies within your organization? Can you handle it? Can you support it? Can you define it? Can you, you know, can you tear it apart? Can you break it down on a piece by piece level? And I think if, you know, if the answers to those are no, then you got some rethinking to do in as far as, you know, the support of your own systems. as far as perceived risks of open source, I think, you know, I don't, yeah.
I mean, if two desktop applications do the same thing, one's open source and proprietary.
I don't understand why people say that that is a risk, being able to, you know, being able to see the source code. Hell, I'd love to see the source code. You know, unfortunately, in a lot of closed applications, it's just not possible to do that. I'd like to know what I'm getting into. You know, I don't want to, you know, buy a car and then find out, well, you know, it's running on 2 cylinders, you know. I'd rather see what's under the hood. But
Do you prefer open source?
I prefer where it makes sense, you know, and in some cases, you know, quite frankly, I mean, as far as end user perspective goes, you know, Microsoft has a lock on that, right? And they have a lock on that for a very good reason, because they make an easy to use operating system, you know, that, you know, with automatic transmission and everything else. So.
Anybody else want to take that?
I'm an open source kind of girl myself, but I think you stated it. It depends on where it's applicable within your organization. So I believe in open source. I believe that we should participate in open source, because then you at least have a voice in it, and you participate in the requirements for what it is you need, not just from the get-go, but, you know, through the out years. The only issue that I've come across in my career with open source is the fact of legally binding. So who owns it? Everybody owns it, right? Which is a great thing. Like you said, we want to see the code, but let's say you have to go to court. It's not going to hold up anywhere. That's the only downfall in today's world that I see with open source. But the technology, I mean, you know, you compare Snort to what's out there from an IDS perspective today, tomorrow, yesterday. How many exploits did, you know, XYZ company have, and how many have Snort had? You know, I mean, there's a
So
huge...
There's certain areas where the open source technology is faster, can adapt quicker.
Absolutely. You manipulate it to what you need to do within your organization. You can customize it to your need. You don't have to wait for, you know, a vendor 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or never to give you, you know, an upgrade or a patch or so on and so forth. So I'm a strong
There's a
proponent.
medium then, you know, to be successful in this game, you're going to need to know what that balance is and adapt quickly. You
Right.
can't just say, well, we're a closed source shop.
Right.
And they wouldn't have much success, you think, in that regard.
There is definitely a balance. I would not say that we are a closed shop at all whatsoever. Because on your larger volume, mundane, commodity type stuff,
Right.
do you really want to use open source?
Right.
Probably not. I would use open source for the more intricate,
And does that-
detailed stuff.
Does that then allow you to get more security people that are familiar with the tool, so you're source more talent faster on open source, say, than a...
Absolutely, and I think that the talent, you retain it too, because people don't get bored, and they want to stay there and keep doing it. They're a part of the overall picture. I have a couple gentlemen sitting right there that do it all the time, and you love it, right? Say yes.
This is a...
See, they're happy.
Yeah, I mean, there's...
Yeah, in our case, Liberty actually uses quite a bit of open source in various areas around the infrastructure. What it really comes down to, I think, for us, is a risk issue. In some cases, there are times that we want to be able to transfer risks associated with software to somebody else. And those risks can take a number of forms. It could be licensing, it could be supportability, it could be any number of things. You can't do that with open source. If you use an open source application, generally speaking, there are exceptions to that. You're taking on that risk yourself, and that for me is part of the equation in making that decision, not just do I get to see the source code and the technology and all that stuff, although those are important, but the key one for me is, do I need to be able to transfer the risk of this thing to somebody else?
And the other aspect that I just want to add to that is, I mean, we've talked about risk and we've talked about the legalities associated with open source, but it's also that whole indemnification, you know. I mean, with that said and everything else, I mean, because we at Continental, I mean, we develop applications that that we sell to a lot of other carriers. You know, and so with that said and everything else, we don't want to be in a situation in which, you know, we may leverage, you know, open source technology, and then, you know, we come back and, I mean, we get hit with legality suits all the time and everything else, you know, and now, you know, with no indemnification clause protecting, you know, the intellectual property of that respective application that we developed, you know, that's not a situation in which, you know, that we want to get into. I mean, we do leverage it as it relates to migrating, you know, applications, you know, and processes off of, you know, the mainframe and stuff like that. But I mean, I just want to bring up as well the whole indemnification issue as well.
Okay. Okay, it looks like we're 5 minutes? 5 minutes left? Good, okay, well, we're vendor vent, if you'd like to. I know you guys are pretty high profile, so you might not do a lot of venting, but the one thing you want to get off your chest here to our audience, maybe these guys can get the problem of saying your feeling, or just share your opinion on any specific technology or regulation you see coming down the road, something that's you want to kind of do a mid-course correction on. Or this is your chance.
I'll take the plunge.
Go slugger.
Well, it's not. It may not be quite exactly what you're going for, but I'll throw one out here. You know, pet peeve of the day is auditors doing Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. And I heard a term recently where that this. I think the correct credit for this goes to Fred Cohen, which is an audit. I can't even say it right. An auditrocity. There we go. Right? It's hard to say, but it's worth it, I think. Right? You get all of this stuff that's getting swept off the shelf of best practices all across the IT organization that have nothing to do with adequate internal controls for Section 404. So there, I'll throw that one out.
So, one thing I'll probably bring up, I'm a little annoyed with every single product that's out there saying, we resolve your SOX issues. And then you ask them how. And
The magic wand. They've got a license on the
I'm thinking, get that.
He was talking about the SOX issues.
Yeah, whoop, sorry about that.
Yeah, let it out. Don't worry, I got it.
The issue is every product out there basically coming to you and saying, we resolve your SOX issues. And fundamentally, when you ask them, they have no idea how. Or if they do, you need to actually explain to them that that particular issue that they deal with isn't even referenceable in SOX. So, I mean, and then you can go down all the other issues as well.
Or they misspell SOX.
Or they misspell SOX.
They misspell HIPAA. Or, yeah, that's the typos. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Or they sell, digital signature. It comes with the application. It's username and log on, the same credential for the network. Those are, yeah.
I would like to snipe we protect you against zero-day attacks. Really? Which ones?
And when?
And when?
Okay, is there any questions from the audience? You, sir? Okay. Encryption bothers you? Are you from the government, sir?
It's applications to do with the wireless it's now Bluetooth coming up there or Bluetooth. It's these applications that we're constantly putting in new technology just to go back
And one at all.
and do encryption. And then when you look at database encryption, how do you do database encryption on the NPI?
Right.
Products out there, they're putting products out there which perform on a system. No one really those issues.
Yeah, the part, and especially when you get into the term definitional arguments of what constitutes encryption, I think for the California law, it's like ROT 13 constitutes encryption. Don't worry about the database tapes that were stolen. We've got it encrypted with ROT 12. Not as strong as 13, but it was encapsulated. Yeah, it was encapsulated. It was encoded strength. The PDP-11.
It's planner's encryption, lightly salted.
Planetary encryption, lightly salted. Sir?
What's the common thread, well, the substantial number of the human element? And you just talked a little bit about technology. You don't really talk about how you prevent either by commission or omission doing things that create illegal chain of security. Talk a little bit about what you do in terms of awareness and deterrence and simply complying with policy procedures in order to help minimize the behavioral, psychological, social element of information security.
I hire a bunch of former Marines, and that pretty much, there's a couple sitting here, that keeps them in line. No. From an incentive perspective, it depends upon who you're addressing from an awareness perspective. So executive management, you kind of glaze them over with the financials and the statistics because they like the numbers and they like the charts. And that usually
gets it down the path. You know, how much did X virus cost you? $8.1 million. Oh my gosh, you know. And then from the technology perspective is, I think that the most difficult piece from security is you have your security professionals and then you have your administrators, and we all need to work together. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult. So in the world of security, it's kind of a cool thing. You can lead the horse to water, and if he doesn't drink, it's okay because it's going to happen. So, you know, and I don't want to sit there and say, I told you so, you know, you didn't put the patch on, whoops, told you so. But it only takes a couple of oops and we all start playing together. So, but the thing is, keep the momentum going. It's not a one-time deal, security awareness or security training or getting them engaged. You have to do it all the time. It's not just during an incident or when you need them, because we need them all the time, and they just don't know they need us.
Due to time constraints, I'm going to call the session to a close. Panelists will be available for the show. Come up, talk to them now. We've got a coffee break going on outside if you want to caffeinate, but let's give them a round of applause.